Here we have the boom bust cycle, the boom bust cycle. And you can see this if you, just Google this boom bust cycle, you would see this pretty much drawn in several different ways. And it would be variations of this. It has a little bit of an explanation down here, but I'm just going to walk us through what causes the boom bust cycle in general. And then here's where it's a depression. See where it says bust or decline? This is a recession. Decline here is recession. Bust, or the trough here, which is this bottom, is a depression. Okay. Now this relates, of course, to the Great Depression. And what made the Great Depression so great? Well, it lasted a really long time. And why did it last so long? That's another question for another time that we'll deal with later. But there is some evidence to suggest it didn't have to last that long. Okay. But anyway, let's deal with what a depression is and how it works, how this cycle works. Okay. A depression, a lot of times, or even a recession, and you may or may not have heard these words before. And unfortunately, studying this in history does not give you really an economic understanding of what was actually going on. This is why in my personal opinion, I think you need people who are economic historians to explain these factors to you, because a lot of times historians are good at history. They can tell you what happened, but they don't really have the economic understanding of why. So you kind of need a dual discipline here. But let's talk about the theory here of the boom bust cycle and talk about what a depression is. A lot of times people think a depression is just mass unemployment or prices seem to drop and a lot of people lose their jobs. A lot of businesses go out of business. I would say those things are usually things that occur with a depression. Those are things that are usually consequences of a depression, but they're not a depression itself, or they're not a recession itself. A recession and a depression, and remember, a depression is just a worse version of a recession, okay? A recession and a depression are simply market corrections back to reality. Now you say, okay, well, corrections, a correction is a good thing. It's better to be correct than incorrect. And while that's true, if you think of what it would be like in a sense of people living on thinking something is true, and then all of a sudden coming crashing down to reality, that can be very painful. Even more so when many people have been operating under false assumptions, false presuppositions, they've been misled, they've been misinformed, and then all of a sudden they come to reality and the effects that can have. And in this case, the effects that return to reality has are often unemployment, business closure, which causes unemployment as well. Often the reactions to those things that can be more or less helpful. And these issues, not just in one place, but spread throughout an economy. And so what causes that? Where does that come from? Well, some people look at the boom bust cycle, and I think this is incorrect, but some people look at the boom bust cycle and think that it's just kind of like a natural occurrence, like hurricanes and fires and stuff, that they just on kind of a cycle happen every once in a while, like forces of nature or like a thunderstorm or something like that. However, they forget in doing that economics is a study of human action and human behavior based on incentives, that humans act and make decisions based on scarcity, based on their environment, based on what the signals and information around them, based on supply and demand, based on prices. And so when those things are artificially manipulated, people make decisions that have real world consequences that they would not otherwise make. So a depression or a recession, or the boom bust cycle that gets to a recession and depression, where does that come from? What causes this type of cycle to happen? And the answer can be put into one simple sentence that we'll expand on and develop, but really it doesn't have to be that complicated. A recession or depression and the boom bust cycle here is caused by this one sentence: an artificial overexpansion of credit. You guys got that? An artificial overexpansion of credit. You say, okay, well, I get the words, but I don't know what that means. Well, we'll walk through it. Artificial means fake, not according to reality. Overexpansion means there's a growth, but it's a growth beyond appropriate demand, right? Meaning it's an overgrowth, it's an overexpansion, it's doing too much, it's a waste. Artificial overexpansion of credit. And you know, well, what's credit? Well, think of like a credit card. Credit is the ability to borrow in order to and borrow money that has to be repaid in order to try to expand or do something in order to spend the money in the present. Okay, so that's what you do with a credit card. Is with a credit card, you're borrowing in the present to pay back in the future, because you'd rather have the credit, the money now that you don't have, so you borrow it in order to pay back in the future. Now, I suggest not doing that, but anyway, so where does this come from? All right, let me walk you through this business cycle theory a little bit. And if you just stay with me, it's actually fairly simple to understand. And we'll talk about where this comes from. I'll circle back to that in a couple minutes here. But what happens is businesses look at market conditions and they look at prices of what it costs to operate and provide their goods and services. Okay. Businesses are looking at this, and businesses are looking at opportunities for growth and to expand so that they can sell their goods and services to more people. Okay, all businesses do this. And businesses, just like individuals, have to look at prices and remember what prices communicate. Prices communicate what's available, either by who wants it at the same time, that's demand, and how much is literally available, that's supply. And when prices increase, people buy less. There's less demand. The price increase tells them that there's less there either because there's literally less supply or there's more people that want it at the same time, or both. This is going back to the very first couple lessons of economics. So like I said, the principles apply to everything. When prices go down, the lower price communicates that there's more available, either because there's literally more of it available in the supply, or there's less people that want it at the same time, or both, and therefore there's a lower price. Now, that applies to what is called interest as well. Interest is the price it costs to borrow money. Interest is the price it costs to borrow money. So when you borrow money from someone, credit card company, a bank, you take out a loan, you take out a house loan, take out a car loan, take out a business loan, whatever, you're borrowing that money and you're paying a price to borrow that money. Now, you're not paying that price in the present, you're paying that price in the future. It's based on what is called time preference. When you borrow, you have a high time preference because you'd rather have more now and pay back more in the future. And so you'd have less in the future, right? Because you have to pay back more. The person who gives the loan, they would rather have less now so that they can have more in the future. Okay, so otherwise there would be no incentive to lend money because other than charity, right? Because the lending of money is somebody would have to give up the ability to spend that money for 5 years, let's say, and by giving up that ability to spend that money for 5 years, they're going to want something more in the future than just their original amount paid back. And so that's where an interest rate comes in. So when you borrow money in order to do something, you are having to pay that entity back at interest. Okay, that's what the price is. Now, the interest rate can be higher or lower. And there is no such thing as a correct or an incorrect interest rate. Now, there can be things that, individuals like or don't like, but the interest rate has to be flexible and fluctuating according to real-time market conditions of supply and demand. Now, what causes an interest rate to go up and an interest rate to go down? Well, remember, an interest rate is just supposed to be a flexible price. And we know how prices work. Prices are signals when they're not manipulated. Prices are signals of supply and demand. They're signals about how much is available and how many people want it at the same time. But what is the interest rate a signal of? What's the supply? Well, an interest rate is a signal of the supply and demand of the available money in an economy, the available savings available in an economy. What causes an interest rate to go up is when people are spending more of their money into the economy. Therefore, there is less savings for businesses to borrow from, and therefore borrowing will cost those businesses more, and therefore you have a higher interest rate. That if you borrow during that time, you're going to have to pay more interest on that money. It's a higher price that discourages people from borrowing, and therefore the demand to borrow money to expand businesses goes down. On the other hand, if the interest rate is low, under normal conditions, that means that less people are spending and more people are saving, and that there's more money available to lend out to people in order to, at a cheaper interest rate, in order to do whatever they're going to do with that lent money or that investment. Okay, so A low interest rate tells you that there's more money, savings available from which to get loans and investments. A higher interest rate tells you that there's less money available from which to get loans and investments. Okay, now the interest rate naturally changes according to that flow of the economy. Sometimes people save, sometimes they don't, right? And they do that based on their own individual reasons. But a lot of people often act in a certain way, in the same way as at the same time. So what businesses are looking for is when an interest rate goes down to them, that tells them this is a good time to invest. This is a good time for us to grow. This is a good time for us to borrow money in order to expand our business and to provide more goods and services. We can invest more in our capital goods, which are like machines to produce what we do and make us more efficient. We can invest more in like office space and grow our and maybe real estate and expand more of places for people to work and computers and all these things that we need to buy to do our job and provide more goods and services to people. We can grow and expand our customer base. So that's usually true, but here's the problem. What happens when an interest rate is artificially manipulated? Okay, if a bunch of money is just artificially added to the economy, which is called inflation, which causes the economy to look like there's a lot more savings, thereby artificially lowering the interest rate when there is not truly more savings there, what starts happening is that low interest rate, or that interest rate that is locked in at a lower price, communicates to people and businesses that there is the opportunity to grow and expand when really there is not. And so what that means is businesses, and you know what happens when you lock in a lower price artificially. If you lock in a low price artificially and there's not the true supply and demand fluctuation with that price, you realize what happened with water. If you lock in the price of water too low, that communicates to people there's more water available and people continue their behavior or even use more water, which can lead to shortages. The same thing happens with interest rates. The interest rate can be locked in artificially low, causing businesses and individuals to invest without the backup of the savings to do that. And so for a while, this causes what's called malinvestment, bad investment, because it causes an artificial growth, a growth that seems to be good. The economy seems to be growing, everything seems to be doing well, and you go through a boom cycle. And that's actually kind of what we're in right now. There's huge amount of debt and money added to the economy artificially. All of a sudden, people have new stimulus checks. Look what happened to GameStop, Bitcoin, other cryptocurrencies, the housing market, stock market. It's all going up right now because a lot more people have had this artificial influx of cash, and now there's a boom. Okay, now you don't know how long a boom or growth is going to last. No economist can predict that. However, you do know that the inflation of this bubble or this balloon cannot last forever. And therefore, at some point, the interest rate cannot continue to be what it is. And therefore, there has to be a market correction where reality will catch up. But what that means is businesses and individuals have been spending all this time and money and energy and investment investing in new ventures to try to expand. And it looks like, wow, everybody's doing great. New skyscrapers are going up. New office buildings are going up. More goods and services are being created. All this stuff looks great, but then all of a sudden it's overexpanded way too much, and there's not the demand for it. And when there's not the demand for it, businesses and individuals lose money. Businesses often go out of business, things start to decline, interest rates increase, and there's a market correction. The interest rates, eventually the price corrects back to what it would otherwise be. They can't continue borrowing and doing what they were doing. No justification for it. And then once you have way too much supply and not enough demand, you're going to have to lower the prices. Prices drop, businesses can't cover their expenses, and therefore that causes them to go out of business, and that causes unfinished products and projects, and that causes unemployment, not just in one business, but spread throughout the economy, because all these businesses and individuals were working off of bad information. They were told borrow, grow, spend at the wrong time. That looked good for a while, but then reality caught up and there was no justification for it. Therefore, they decline, they go out of business, they go into a recession, the market corrects, the interest rate corrects to what is more normal, and they go into a sharp decline, a bust. This bottom of where you would call a depression is called the trough. That's when it hits its lowest point. And that's what causes the boom bust cycle, is the artificial overexpansion of credit. And then people don't usually learn. They usually misdiagnose and blame other things. They blame lack of regulation. They blame businesses that spent too much and overextended themselves, which they are, partially at fault as well, but they're working off of bad information. And so the kind of dismal part of this, of being an economist and understanding this, is people don't understand what caused this in the first place, and the same cycle starts over. Now, it takes time, and it doesn't happen every day, but this usually takes place over and over again, over a set of years. And I would say we're pretty much probably here. I don't know the timing. No economist does. And if any economist tells you that they do know the timing of a boom or a bust or anything like that, I wouldn't trust them, because any economist would be honest enough to say that they know enough to know what they don't know. And what we don't know is when. But we're in this area of artificial growth, and eventually there will be a decline. Now, as an individual, best thing you can do in this situation, be financially stable, be out of debt, that type of thing. That's just some personal finance advice. But this is what causes the boom bust cycle. But who does the artificial expansion of credit? Where does that come from? Who sets the interest rates? Well, throughout American history, it's been a couple different entities in conjunction, okay, meaning working together. The first time this really happened on a large scale was the Panic of 1819. Depressions used to be called panics. And the Panic of 1819 happened because during the War of 1812, the United States used to have to pay for its wars with gold and silver, with some sort of actual backed currency, okay? However, wars are hugely expensive. And so the US government allowed banks to do something that otherwise would have been illegal, and print more money than they actually had in gold and silver. And that printing paper money all into the economy pumped up the economy artificially and caused this kind of first major boom bust cycle. You have the first Bank of the United States doing this. You have the second Bank of the United States doing this. And then in 1913, you have the creation of the Federal Reserve, or the Fed, which does this writ large. It's America's central bank. It's neither technically private nor technically government. It's a quasi-public-private entity, which causes an artificial overexpansion of credit through the creation of new money, through inflation. When they create a bunch of new money, that tends to add more fake savings to the interest rate, thereby lowering the interest rate and causing the boom bust cycle. So